I would like to extend a very warm welcome to viewers in the Philippines, the United States of America, and around the world. I am Leo Lefebvre, a professor of theology at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., and a faculty fellow of the William R. Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. In February 2022, the Berkeley Center hosted an online discussion of 500 years of Christianity and the global Filipina post-colonial perspectives. The discussion in that forum led to further research, resulting in the publication of a new volume by Palgrave Macmillan, edited by Cristina Yedo Gomez, Agnes Brazal, and Maria Marilu Ibita, 500 Years of Christianity and the Global Filipina, Post-Colonial Perspectives. The book offers a splendid overview of many aspects of Filipina Christian identity in various contexts, past and present. The moderator of our discussion will be Dr. Cristina Yedo Gomez, who is the Presentation Sisters Senior Lecturer in Theology at BBI, the Australian Institute of Theological Education, and a Research Fellow for the Australian Centre for Christianity and Culture. I now invite Cristina to lead our conversation.
Magandang gabi, magandang hapon, magandang umaga sa inyong lahat. Good morning, good evening, or good afternoon, wherever you are zooming in from this world. I'd like to acknowledge first the First Nations lands and people on which we are gathering from all over the world. Particularly for me, the Guringai and Darug peoples, who are the original custodians of the land I'm speaking from. I acknowledge their stories, traditions, and living cultures, and commit to the ongoing work of reconciliation and building a brighter future together. I also acknowledge our ancestor spirits who walk with us, do this work of decolonizing with us. We couldn't do this work simply on our own. So, we're just very excited to be launching this book today. Myself, Professor Agnes, and Professor Marilu Ibita. It's been 2 years since that wonderful 2-day webinar event, and we did promise you that we will produce a book for you. And so here we are today. We've got this book, and we've got wonderful authors who joined us as well, and you'll hear from some of them today. So the agenda for this webinar is broken into 3 parts. The first part is we will have input from 3 of our new authors that you haven't heard from yet from that webinar, from that 2-day webinar. And that's Professor Lily Mendoza, Dr. Jemina Jugo, and Professor James Perkinson. So I'll introduce them in more detail as just before they speak. The second part of this webinar is Father Elizar and Professor Astorga, who will give responses to the chapters and to the book overall. And all of them have about 10 minutes each to present. And the last part of this webinar is a Q&A discussion dialogue session. So if you're thinking of any comments or questions that come up for you as presentations are being presented, please feel free to enter them in the Q&A section. It's just on the bottom of your screen next to the record and show captions buttons. So without further ado, let us enter into the first section of this webinar. So the first speaker is Professor Lily Mendoza. Professor Lily Mendoza is a Kapampangan-born Filipina and currently resides in Wahweotanong, aka Detroit, the traditional homeland of the Anishinaabe peoples, Wyandot, Huron, Fox, Miami, and Sauk. She is full professor of culture and communication at Oakland University in Rochester, Michigan, and is known for her path-breaking work on the politics of indigeneity, particularly within the Philippine diasporic and homeland contexts. Currently, she serves as the executive director of the Center for Babaylan Studies, a movement for decolonization and indigenization among diasporic Filipinos. Her most recent book publication is the co-edited volume, Decolonizing Eco-Theology, Indigenous and Subaltern Challenges, published through Wippenstock in 2022. There are actually quite a number of us engaged in a decolonizing process with Ate Lily and Ate Leni Strobel. Her sister who is a retired professor. The process is called Pagsuyo, which refers to the courting of our Indigenous hearts, minds, and souls. It is my great pleasure to introduce to you Ate Lily, as we refer to her, or Professor Mendoza, who is very much well placed to present to us her chapter, Back from the Crocodile's Belly, When Christian Formation Meets Indigenous Resurrection. Professor Mendoza.
Thank you, Christina. Maya pabengi, dirinan da kayo maya payato. That's good greetings from my native tongue of Kapampangan. And you've already mentioned where I'm coming from, Wawiyatanong, where the river bends, otherwise known as Detroit, Michigan, USA. But I also want to take time to honor the original keepers of the land where I was born, Pampanga in Central Luzon, Philippines, the amazing Aita peoples to whom I owe a debt of the heart, traditionally nomadic hunter-gatherers with encyclopedic knowledge of their environment, who have suffered endless exile, racialization, and displacement at the hands of straight-haired, fairer-skinned Austronesian Malay descent settler peoples like myself, committed even at this late hour to the vision of material progress and advancement, flattening mountains, redirecting rivers, paving over soils and farmlands in the Aita's ancestral homeland in the course of building the state-of-the-art, purportedly ecological and sustainable megalopolis they call the New Clark City. I first wrote the original version of this piece when I was invited to give a talk at the Nagel Institute for the Study of World Christianity at the Calvin College in Grand Rapids, Michigan, coming at the heels of the launch of my co-edited book, Back from the Crocodile's Belly, Philippine Babylon Studies and the Struggle for Indigenous Memory. And at the time, little did I know that the Institute's funders were right there on the front row. I may have caused quite a stir and no mean trouble to my good friend and colleague who was instrumental in bringing me in. But that experience of my first time sharing of my story of reverse conversion, if you may call it that, was uncannily instructive. Having laid out in all earnestness my story of awakening to our people's indigenous understanding of the world, all I was asked at the end was whether I was still a Christian or not. But most striking of all was the assessment of on another occasion of one of my most beloved Christian mentors who was heard saying, "Lily has gone off the deep end." To share some of that story, I often refer to myself as a dyed-in-the-wool child of modern Christian civilization, a pastor's kid with a born-again experience in college, and some of the best years of my life spent missionizing the intelligentsia in the Philippines. But unbeknownst to many, I suffered from a psychic dis-ease that no amount of preaching of God's unconditional love could assuage or heal. I describe it as a constant sense of being weighed and found wanting, something akin to W.E.B. Du Bois' description as this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. It was also the case that the universalism of my Christian faith disconnected me from any cultural grounding. I was, first and foremost, a child of God and a Filipina only by accident. That is, until my faithful encounter with the world of our indigenous peoples, of all places, in a graduate seminar titled The Image of the Filipino in the Arts, taught by an ethnomusicology professor who brought into the classroom the amazing arts of our indigenous communities that were the least penetrated by modern development and Christianization. Their intricate weaving designs, the wild, vibrant colors of their textiles, their basketry, dances, songs, and chants, and what they expressed in terms of a different way of being in the world. Among others, the delicate sensitivity of kapwa, or shared being, the generosity of community, the reverential relationship with the earth that took nothing without asking for permission and without giving something back ritually in return. I was stunned, and I said, wow, these are my people. I belong to a beautiful people. And that was what began my deep psychic healing. And having fallen in love with the beauty of that different way of being, I became consumed with trying to understand this inferiorizing civilizational narrative that is every bit Christian in its garb, that would turn an otherwise healthy, wholesome, thriving peoples living sustainably on the land into degraded, subhuman, primitive subjects, all of a sudden in need of salvation and deliverance from their wicked and savage ways. People living honorable lives, concerned not primarily with themselves, but with feeding the world, the one they call the holy in nature, banal na inang kalikasan, in everything observing courtesy of approach, not entitlement. Having just embraced this amazing kin as my own and craving their tutelage, I wanted to do all I can to stop their annihilation and disappearance. And in fact, wanting the magnificence of their world to now be held up as a mirror for what life could once again be after the ravages of our nature-hating, objectifying, and coercive culture. And what I learned is that the Christian civilizational narrative is actually premised on a number of unnamed presuppositions. Number one, the denigration and demonization of all land-based subsistence ways of living as little more than animal-like existence, as though being animals were such an insult. We are animals. Number two, the absence of coercive structures of governance, i.e., no taxation, no hierarchical system of government, no standing armies, etc., as a signifier of backwardness and primitivism. Any social arrangement that didn't fit the domination/control system was misrecognized as anarchic and therefore uncivilized, where you get the construction of Palestine as a land without a people for a people without a land. Number three, the lack of private ownership, everything shared in common within an ethic of abundance and generosity, and not only toward fellow humans, but toward all beings, as totally scandalous and unacceptable. And finally, in terms of defining what constituted a full human being, you had to have the following characteristics. Number one, a form of rationality exclusive of feelings, passions, and intuition. Number two, an acquisitive nature committed to an aggressive pursuit of material wealth. Three, efficiency as the highest value, going for maximum outcome with minimum effort. Four, belief in individualism, the notion of a sovereign self, unconstrained by the baggage of communal obligations, free to do whatever it wants, etc. And lastly, private ownership, where the introduction of the Regalian doctrine, the Spanish version of the doctrine of Christian discovery, saw the closing of the commons and the expropriation of non-titled indigenous lands into state property. So with these default assumptions, what happened is that any other life way that didn't answer to these modern civilizational imperatives are by default less than, and that the only imaginable mode of relation to such is that of assimilation into the dominant culture, not parity and respect. To close out my time, I want to read from the concluding part of my essay. In the olden days, when my life's purpose as a Christian was about bringing everyone to the fold under the banner of Christ, whenever I encountered anyone of a different faith, no matter my attempts at dialogue, cultural sensitivity, or compassionate opening to the truths of other practices or traditions, in the end, I always had the trump card up my sleeve. As Filipino thinker, scholar, and Christian writer Melba Magay cannot help but conclude, even after her excellently nuanced analysis of the cultural faux pas of the early Protestant missionaries in the Philippines in her book, A Clash of Cultures, and I quote, "We need to wrestle with our own culture at its point of greatest power and peril, if we are to bring it under the light of Christ. Only then can we presume to say something about the uniqueness and superiority of Christ to the great cultures around us," unquote. Meaning, cut through the smoke and mirrors. The goal in devoting all that effort to understanding the indigenous culture was finally, simply, one more time, to more effectively bring Filipinos under the superior sign of Christ. For much of my adult life, I was myself the articulator of this supposed supremacy that ironically was ultimately also doing damage to me. And for more than 30 years now, my work has been to pursue relentlessly the grip of that superiority on my own soul and its reach into the culture of my people in order to undo its damaging denigration and to recover a much bigger and more indigenous sense of God and spirit in my life. So the question I now ask continually is the following: what if, as Christians, we were to humbly lay down the trump card, no matter if doing so may feel like going off the deep end, and take genuine curiosity in others, not just for the purpose of better missionizing them, but to learn from what they have to teach us from their own truths? Are we willing to let the Christian story take its place as only one, worthy as it is, among many other true stories, in a posture of mutual giving and co-creation of a future we can all share? Andrew Walls, leading British historian of Christian missions, may have uncannily given us a hint on precisely the kind of humility needed for such a gesture of divestment. In his parsing out of his understanding of the word primal, he strips the word of its evolutionary connotations and notes, and I quote, "The word primal is not a euphemism for primitive. The word helpfully underlines two features of the religions of the peoples indicated: their historical anteriority and their basic elemental status in human experiences. All other faiths are subsequent and represent, as it were, second thoughts," unquote. Could it be that all this time, that is what we have been doing, majoring on second thoughts? And that it's now high time to listen to and learn again from those who, against all odds, have remained rooted in that primal revelation, that is the earth herself, the ultimate source of wisdom. Time to take the plunge. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Mendoza, for that very insightful sharing of your experience, but also your analysis of that experience. And it's true, we all have to grapple with that difficult part of that legacy that Christianity has left with us. And your question is perfect for this moment in time. Especially when all Christians all over the world are actually being called to listen and take up this thing called the synodal path, according to Pope Francis. We'll explore more what you've presented in the Q&A I will now move on to Dr. Jugo. Dr. Jugo, Jamina Vesta M. Jugo, is lecturer in European Studies at Ateneo de Manila, Philippines. She finished her doctorate in political science at the University of Göttingen, Germany, and then became a fellow of the European Leadership Program in Brussels, Belgium in 2022. In 2023 and up to February this year, she worked for Missio in Aachen, Germany. Dr. Jugo enjoys intersectional and interdisciplinary work and hopes to discover more ways to build bridges between Asia and Europe. While Jamina is a political scientist and not a theologian, I especially enjoyed her fresh approach to Mary, and it gave me much to think about regarding my own work on Mariology. I think she will give you much to think about too. I give you Dr. Jugo.
Hi, thanks so much for the introduction and for inviting me to the talk. I'd actually like to start by acknowledging all the migrants who have gone to and passed through where I am. So hello from Aachen in Germany. So I would like to acknowledge all of these people on the move, no matter what kind of category that they were sorted into by the state, and no matter when they arrived, whether they just arrived or a few generations ago or centuries ago before there was anything like any German state on these lands. We all came from somewhere and we're all on our way to somewhere in one manner of speaking or another, and we should all be proud of that. So now on to my talk proper. So I wanted to, run through the main points of the chapter that I have in the book. It's called Inang Diyos, Inang Bayan, the Virgin Mary and Filipino Identity. So I'm actually looking at Marianism in the Philippines from the perspective of nation building. And one of the jumping off points for my talk was, the multifariousness of Marianism in the Philippines. As Deirdre de la Cruz says in her really brilliant book, Mother Figured, which is about Marianism and the Filipino Universal. There are many Marys in the Philippines, in the Filipino imagination, maybe as many Marys as there are Filipinos. I'm paraphrasing here. There's many Marys, but somehow they're all one. And somehow this mirrors the ideal that we're struggling towards as this nation whose fragmented identity and very long, complicated history of colonialism and fragmented geography means that the quest for building a nation and finding an identity is something that maybe will have to always be a work in progress. So there are many ways to be Filipino, but also an ideal of one nation. There are many Marys, but there are also one Mary, many and one, somehow overlapping. And within this imaginary, there's many ways to place yourself as a Filipino devotee. A lot of people identify themselves with some version of Mary, but also, or maybe at the same time, as a child of Mary. And it helps that in a lot of Filipino languages, there's actually the word for child or offspring is gender neutral. So no matter what gender you are, you can be anak ni Maria in Tagalog and many other Filipino languages. So within this very flexible imaginary, there's definitely room for something such as a diasporic Marianism. This here is the Virgin of Antipolo, who among many things is referred to as Our Lady of Migrants. So if you're an OFW, you might see your story in that of Mary as somebody who has to sacrifice for the family. This kind of sacrificial maternal version of the Virgin Mary. But then again, that kind of parallels with the experience of a lot of people who are left behind by an OFW in the Philippines. You are essentially a sacrificial figure who has to send someone else that you love to go abroad on this difficult, arduous, sacrificial journey to sort of be a localized Messiah for your family or for your community. So the point that I'm driving at is that no matter which side of this diasporic Germany you're on, there's something in Filipino Marianism for you. So there's a lot of ways that Marianism resonates with today's global Filipino. But at the same time, we have to grapple with this colonial history, the legacy of Marianism, which can very often turn oppressive, like in Filipino politics and culture. Like a lot of our feminist theologians, like some of which are actually here in this room, the Zoom room, have grappled with how Marianism from the onset of Spanish colonial rule was weaponized. I don't think that's too strong a word, against Filipino girls and women in a way to sort of like tame them into this idea of what a proper Hispanized Catholic woman was supposed to be. This ideal of a very domestic, even submissive woman who doesn't really have much of an identity besides being a good wife and mother. And this definitely has an impact on how Filipino women see themselves, girls and women see themselves or like raise their daughters until today. And when you combine that with the very pastoral-oriented, let's say, tendency in Filipino Catholicism, like to really emphasize Good Friday, maybe at the expense of Easter, what you have is this like dominant strand of Marianism that's very focused on suffering, which is not necessarily bad. Like it can help to like dignify people's suffering and get them through their very worst times, or to show that there's definitely like value in being a woman, in being a matriarch, even if ostensibly that's devalued in a patriarchal society. That at the same time there's kind of less support when it comes to trying to find your way out of cycles of suffering. So what do you do once you've survived Good Friday? Like where can you find the Easter in all of this? So these kinds of tendencies we find not only in Filipinos' private lives, but I would argue it's very much like a public matter as well. Political Marianism is something that like presided over our politics at some very key moments, like quite literally here. If you look at, the legacy of people power, I think like if you've been to Metro Manila, you probably had to like stare up at this monument while you were in a traffic jam at some point. So this is very familiar. That I would also argue that for a lot of women who enter into politics for the past few generations, it's hard to escape this expectation that you have to embody some kind of Marianism somehow, to present yourself as this very like pure, virtuous, sacrificial mother figure, and then reflect that in your leadership. Like we see this like cemented in the image that we have of a figure like Corazon Aquino, let's say, very emblematic. And arguably, like this surfaced again, not exactly the same, but very similar in the last national election. This is a political cartoon of Leni Robredo. I'm not sure if you can recognize the face, but that's who it's supposed to be. And the idea of the article that this came from was that there was like too much Marianism inflected into the Leni Robredo political campaign, and that people were expecting her to like work miracles in Filipino politics as some kind of, well, national supermom, if I can be a bit colloquial about it. But unfortunately, like the limits of this narrative like really showed up during the campaign, and it didn't resonate with a lot of Filipinos, especially in the face of so much like disinformation, very uneven campaign spending and power dynamics. And what resonated instead was what has been called like the macho messianism of the Duterte movement. Like that's a very interesting term from social scientist Charmila Parmanand. And I would also argue that there's a messianism that you can find in the Bongbong Marcos messaging as this sort of like scion of a dynasty that promised to save the country. And, his dynasty is not immune from Marianism as well. Maybe some of you have seen this mural before if you ever passed through the Heart Center Hospital. As far as I know, it's still on one of the walls of the ground floor. This is a mural of Imelda Marcos, very Marian imagery, complete with doves and everything. So you can find this kind of narrative on many sides of political and public life in the Philippines. It's pretty difficult to escape both the cycles like that are brought about by this story. But what I call for in my essay in the book is not necessarily to leave Marianism behind, but rather to look at it a bit more critically and find the potential in these Marian traditions and Filipino culture and religion that maybe aren't looked at so much because they're outside maybe like the dominant Catholic or academic traditions. And one example would be like this one here. This is from Aglipayan Christianity. It's Our Lady of Balintawak, who is said to have aided the Katipuneros by basically warning them against a deadly attack by Spanish forces that would have probably like nipped the revolution in the bud. And I would say like the visual representation here is very important. What we have here is a very European looking Virgin Mary, like, you know, blonde European features, but dressed as a lowland, like Filipino peasant woman, which is actually like in Aglipayan canon. So this is a very hybrid Mary. Yes, the colonial tradition is there, but very much a Mary who's taking sides, who's helping like push the story towards emancipation. So this is something like some potential that we could really investigate here. And since we're also talking about like a global Filipino Catholicism, I would say there's a lot of mutual benefit to be had in joining like, a lot of international discussions about alternative Marian traditions. This is one that's cropped up on and off, especially in Italy. This is a depiction of Mary who's actually there at Easter. She's shown as being one of the first people who Jesus appeared to when he rose from the dead. This is not in the Bible at all. But at the same time, it's very resonant with this idea that like, why should Mary not be at Easter? She was there through all the bad times. She was there, you know, during the worst of Christ's suffering. Why should she not have a part in this salvific future that was promised? She should have a claim on that too, as do all people who identify themselves in their story. So I think these are like a lot of, you know, discussions that are worth digging into. And I look forward to like talks like these throughout the presentation. And once again, thanks so much for having me at this event.
Thanks so much, Dr. Jugo, for your wonderful and but brief presentation. We really have to grapple with this idea of Mary as potentially both a tool of oppression, but also a tool of liberation. And if we only see her as a tool of oppression or only as a tool of liberation, then we're not seeing the full picture, and we're not applying that proper critique. So, yeah.
Just a little update for some information in my chapter. I found this out after the book came out, and I'm a little bit annoyed, but that alternative interpretation of Mary, who was there like right after the resurrection, who got visited by Jesus, it's not just alternative and underground. It was acknowledged by Pope John Paul. There's an official document from 1997. I just found it a couple of days ago. So this is a thing that really crops up in the church. It's not just a very like marginal thing. So I think this is something we forget, but it's really worth digging into. And I found it out because I was asked to work on this book.
It's wonderful. That's great. We'll bring it up again at Q&A. That's really excellent. So now we move to the last speaker for this first section of the webinar, and that is Professor James Perkinson. James Perkinson has lived for 35 years as a white settler on Three Fires land in inner city Detroit, currently teaching as Professor of Social Ethics at the Ecumenical Theological Seminary and lecturing in Intercultural Communication Studies at the University of Oakland, Michigan. He holds a PhD in theology from the University of Chicago, is the author of Political Spirituality for a Century of Water Wars, The Angel of the Jordan Meets the Trickster of Detroit, and many others. Oh, notably, there's one quite interesting one, Messianism Against Christology, Resistance, Movements, Folk Arts and Empire, and Shamanism, Racism, and Hip-Hop Culture, Essays on White Supremacy and Black Subversion. He's a very, very interesting man. And yeah, he's also an artist on the spoken word poetry scene and an activist in the struggle against water shutoffs. He's also married to Professor Lily Mendoza, so it's a wonderful partnership there. And what I really appreciate about Professor Perkinson's chapter is the idea of Jesus learning from the land. I mean, if you think about it, it makes sense, but yeah, it was never put into my imagination until I read Professor Perkinson's chapter. So thank you very much. And here I give to you, Dr. Perkinson.
Yes, so I'm actually in my second educational endeavor. It's called My Wife and Filipino Culture. It's ongoing, and I doubt I'll ever graduate. Actually, I hope I don't. I'll just jump right in with riffing on my chapter a little bit. So it takes off from the sharp polemic of Asian liberation theologian Aloysius P. Rees offered in the 1980s, to the effect that Jesus began his vocation not by baptizing, but by being baptized. What he was baptized into was the local watershed and a movement of people recovering the 2 millennia old wisdom traditions of Israel's ancestors who had lived close to the land with their herd animals. In an age of apocalyptic climate blowback like now, in which the earth herself is throwing up the kind of indictment Moses had promised earliest Israel, calling heaven and earth to witness against the people if they chose a death-dealing way of living, the conviction is prophetic and damning. And the chapter engages then in a lot of biblical reflection, but it's anchored in the present, in particular in an event that took place in 2017 in Angeles, Pampanga, where some 20 representatives of Clark Development Corporation, Ayala Land Incorporated, the Department of Education, faculty of the University of the Philippines, Clark, were gathered along with 3 of us from the outside, Lily Mendoza, the primary invitee, and she turned to 2 others of us, myself, and a woman named Carmen Schurman, who's part Aita, part of the indigenous folk in Pampanga, and who had done her work at Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary and pulled Lily into her dissertation committee. And it was all about discussing the possible development of a UPC-sponsored Indigenous Studies Center, where most of the folk involved were thinking it should focus on helping the indigenous Aita by supplying them with modern education and Western-inspired development skills. And the 3 of us were raising issue with who it is who really needs help, contending that no, it's us modern educated, urbanized, industrially dependent, out of niche casualties of neoliberal globalization, deluded into trying to live individualized lifestyles at the expense of the entire planet in service of colonial and corporate families who actually needed help. And so the 2-day gathering, the first day, 3 hours in, listening to report after report on the simply backward condition and impoverished desperation of the Aita, seemingly begging redress and a concerted development intervention. When Schurman had had enough, she had ducked out unobtrusively outside to pick up 3 small stones from the hotel grounds, brought them back, and furtively handed them to each one of us to hold, and thus be anchored by at least a few tiny representatives of the natural world outside that artificial space in this hotel in Angeles. And then finally, she pushed back from the table, stood up to intervene in the flow of conversation, disavowing the characterization of the Aita thus far offered and apologizing in pseudo-deference to civilized ideals of decorum. She then unleashed a long crescendoing belly wail that cut the entire room off at the knees like some suddenly appearing spirit bolo. Yeah. And it entirely flipped the conversation in the room from that point forward, where we could then talk about the genius and beauty and wisdom of an indigenous culture like the Aita that the rest of us had lost track of and lost sight of in our own ancestry and our own ways of living. And so for the next day and a half, we pursued that. But it also flipped me into the biblical tradition, which I read as a state-produced text licensing monarchical land grabs that nonetheless has up inside it traces of memories of a much more indigenous way of living by early Israelites, by Canaanite peoples, and other folk in that Eastern Mediterranean region. And so for me, it's always a question of how do you read the scripture? The genius is that underneath something like slaves obey your masters, you have an actual recounting of a successful slave revolt called the Exodus, animated by a cry. It begins with the people crying out under duress, oppressed in Egypt, don't even have a name to attach their cry to, that is centered in the tradition as the galvanizing moment for the entire tradition. And what that then also links up for me with is the cry of Abel in the preface to the Bible, the Genesis 1 through 11 texts, and the recounting of that story as what I would understand is not a story of original sin, but original conflict. The conflict brewing up between city-state systems devoted to monocrop agriculture, coercing plants, animals, and a great percentage of the human population into generating surplus for fat cat lifestyle elites over against the struggle of indigenous folk living sustainably in their ecologies, or the first human resistance movement our species ever engaged in, pastoral nomad folk, herder folk who were integrated into those early city-state systems, but could take their herd animals out and not return and be integrated into the grasslands and do just fine without the city-state system. They could eat without relying on where they had come from. They could rely on their animals. And Cain killing Abel is actually an emblem of that ongoing struggle, which has gone on for the rest of history. There was an article in the press just this last week, Maasai under attack in Tanzania. Pastoral nomad folk there who live on the land with their herd animals who are being pushed off and forced to settle by the Tanzanian government. The cry of Abel is a cry that of his blood. He never says anything in the biblical text, but the blood falls into the ground, and the text says the mouth opened to receive the blood and emanates a cry that is a cry of both the human being and the land, and becomes, I think, definitive of the entire tradition, hovering over it as a memory of disappeared indigenous folk. All the way through the Gospels, Jesus references to Abel as the primary beginning of the prophetic line that he rides in himself, all the way up to the book of Revelation and the collapse of the city of Babylon, because the blood of Abel and all the innocents and all the indigenous is found up in there. The last thing I would say, because I'm already up against my timeline, it goes so quick, is that I also read the baptism of Jesus as a plunge into that local ecology. Under the waters of the Jordan, the primary watershed, rain, the closest thing you get to an embodiment of divinity, the storm of the that washed down biodiversity to everybody and every creature downstream from there and make life possible. Jesus goes into those waters, comes up. He is then greeted by the heavens opening, which elsewhere in the scripture is referenced to a storm and a thunder voice. He's adopted by a storm, a rainstorm, And the oldest image we have of YHWH throughout the biblical tradition is as a storm god embodied in the clouds and rains and water. And then a dove descends and becomes his tutor, driving him to go out and be tested and schooled by rocks, which is a deep old thing in the biblical tradition, et cetera, et cetera. And then we go from that back to an instance of rebaptism in Mindanao. Albert Alejo, a Jesuit priest and anthropologist who walks through a recovery of traditional instruments and dances on the land that results in those people engaging in a 3-day ritual where they take back on all of the gifts and the influence of copper, of bamboo, of betel nut, etc., that is really baptizing them, in a sense, out of their Christian baptism and back into the land. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Perkinson. You really point out to us that the colonialism, even of our anthropocentrism, and that we really need to pay attention when we pay attention to the land around us and what's going on there. You know, it opens us up to something else, and decenters our whole human focus, human centeredness. So, we have just finished the first part of this webinar. We're now entering into the second part, which is responses to the book and to the chapters by Professors Astorga and Professor Fernandez. So I will move on to that next section. So we begin with Professor Astorga's response. She is a well-known name in the international theological world, as many of these people on this Zoom are. She is the former chair of the theology department of the Ateneo de Manila, Loyola Schools, and was the founding director of the Center for the Study of Catholic Social Thought of Duquesne University in 2007 and 11. Professor Astorga was also awarded a number of things, including a fellowship at the Jesuit Institute of Boston College, Woodstock Theological Center, Georgetown University, and a visiting scholarship at Fordham University. She currently teaches theological ethics, bioethics, sexual ethics, and feminist ethics. She had a book that was awarded, Catholic Moral Theology and Social Ethics, A New Method, and that was the best book by the College Theology Society in 2014 and 2015 by the Catholic Press Association of America. She is also published in a number of journals, including Asian Horizons, Concilium, Journal of Society of Christian Ethics. I give to you, Dr. Astorga.
So warm greetings to the authors and participants of the online book launch of the 500 Years of Christianity in the Philippines and the Global Filipino-Filipina, Post-Colonial Perspectives. Our special congratulations to Agnes Brazal, Cristina Liedo Gomez, and Marilu Ibita for their masterful work as editors of a landmark book in Filipino theology. This is an impressive collection of articles by some of our finest Filipino theologians. Reading the articles was like being feted in a banquet or a feast of Filipino theology. After I read the last article and closed the book, I said, Filipino theology has arrived. A theology that has been struggling to find its identity, whose voice has not been heard, or if heard, has been marginalized or rendered below par compared to the North American Eurocentric theology or white theology, has found its respectable and honored place at the table of theological discourse. Filipino theology has a name, a face, a voice, and a place, distinctive as it is unique, coming out of its pre-colonial, colonial past into the post-colonial age in a highly plural, multiple, diverse, and globalized world. I start by presenting two images of Christianity. One is the helicopter Christianity. While descending, the helicopter blows away everything that is on the ground to clear a path for Christianity to land. An apt image for colonial Christianity, all the elements on the ground have to be removed, likened to wiping out religions, cultures, the entire way of life of people, for Christianity to be transplanted in Asian soil, particularly into the Philippine soil. The second image is the bullock cart Christianity. This is a vehicle very much indigenous to Asia and represents a Christianity that is at once truly native and homegrown, as well as modest and humble. Coming not from above, but from below, the bullock cart is enabled to move when it is in continuous contact on the ground and the friction and energy is generated. This is the enculturated, contextualized, indigenized Christianity that emerges out of the people, of the religions and cultures. The articles in the book refer to both images. Not seen as qualifying as humans in the eyes of the colonizers, natives were dispossessed of their land, territories, resources with impunity. Regarding themselves as superior to them, they obliterate their religions and practices, condemning them as diabolical, the work of demons. In the marriage of the church and state, the state's colonizing agenda was wedded with the evangelizing pursuits of the church. Christianity was virtually used as a tool for colonialism. This is particularly emblematic in the story of the Babaylans, as told in the article by Lily Mendoza, and I quote, "Back from the crocodile's belly, Christian formation meets indigenous resurrection radar," parts of which I quote. When the Spaniards began to understand the power and potency of the Babaylan, they so feared the latter's prowess that they not killed many of them, but in some instances fed them to crocodiles to ensure their total annihilation. Corpses of a Babaylan charismatic rebel leader and his followers were impaled on bamboo stakes and deliberately placed on the mouth of a river to be eaten by crocodiles. The story captures a broad truth. Colonial violence did consume indigenous culture. Carolyn Brewer details the systemic demonization of these indigenous healers and their ostracism and social dismemberment as brujas or witches. This colonial violence is called by Spivak as epistemic violence, the trauma visited upon a people's psyche where their sense of themselves and their world is exploded to denigration, demonization, delegitimation, or simply disallowance. Lily Mendoza, using powerful quote by one Filipino scholar, describes the impact of the internalization of this devaluation of one's culture. And I quote, "The moment we begin to view ourselves through Western eyes, what we held sacred suddenly became worthless. Our virtues were turned into vices, our strengths turned into weaknesses, and our triumphs into failures. We could no longer be proud of anything truly our own and began to regard anything native as primitive and undeveloped. Anything indigenous became a source of embarrassment and uneasiness," unquote. In the same vein, Lenny Strobel writes, "This dispossession of the land led to the dispossession of our minds and bodies, our language, our indigenous wisdom, knowledge, and practices, and especially our indigenous spirituality," unquote. How can we liberate ourselves from the dark grip of colonialism. I propose that we need to engage in the bullock cart Christianity. We have to stay as close as we can on the ground or the soil of our culture, our religion, our way of life. It is a Christianity from below that resonates with who we are, what we value, how we see and feel the world, and what moves us to tears, and what gives us hope. The introductory article of the book speaks of the tasks of post-colonial criticism. First, it includes analysis of historical and biblical documents for their colonial entanglements, resurrecting or foregrounding suppressed voices, such as that of dominated peasants and women, and interacting with and reflecting on hybridity, deterritorialization, and double or multiple identities resulting from these cultural encounters. The ultimate goal of post-colonial criticism is to decolonize knowledge and praxis of Christianity. It continues and asserts that our Filipino-centrism from a post-colonial perspective does not mean romanticizing native versus the Western. Rather, it highlights the liberating elements in the traditions that emerged from the colonized and/or marginalized groups, as well as from the encounter between cultures, unquote. We cannot do the task of post-colonial criticism unless we do bullock cart Christianity. The other word for bullock cart Christianity is immersion. As James Perkinson in his paper, Rebaptizing Spirit in the Land and Ancestry pointed out, Asian liberation theologian Aloysius Pieris offered in the 1980s that Jesus began his vocation not by baptizing, but by being baptized. Perkinson asserts that the first task and true test of any missionary enterprise is not teaching, preaching, or conversion, but immersion in the most profound sense. So Jesus himself was immersed into the waters. We have to immerse ourselves into the waters of our religious culture, the Babaylan culture, the Quiapo Black Nazarene, the Passion, the Marian devotions, and others. And only from the depths and from the ground can we engage in accommodation, appropriation, resistance that is truthful, meaningful, liberating, and life-giving. The article Indigenization as Appropriation by Pablo Virgilio David and Maria Maricel S. Ibita concludes that accommodation makes way for indigenization and appropriation. They say that they assert that the more humane approach to evangelization is the willingness to make space for mutual accommodation and for intercultural dialogue. A friendly accommodation is the beginning of religious appropriation. The Etas, for instance, had no problem accepting Bibles from the Protestants, singing religious hymns of the Iglesia Ni Cristo and evangelicals, or even worshiping and dancing the charismatic way. They accepted the religious worldview of their guests, but appropriated them in their own terms. But we can only accept in our own terms if we are immersed in who we are, what we truly value. And only when we are immersed do we come and see the truth is more complex and more nuanced. The article of Daniel Franklin E. Pilario, The Double Truth of Colonial Mission, unmasks the monologic reading brought about by hegemonic colonial practice. To understand the historical events of colonization, there is a need to be open to ambivalence, imprecision, and indeterminacy that is their double truth, as these same practices also contain unintended surplus of meaning beyond the conscious intentions of the historical agents, unquote. While the church may have been a colonial accessory or apparatus of the colonial appropriation, it was also a force of good, of truth, of justice. Horacio de la Costa writes, "It serves no useful purpose to conceal the fact that the record of the church in the Philippines is a spotted one. It accomplished great things. It was also subject from time to time to great abuses." Unquote. Florina Orilose won in her article Toward Reclaiming the Wisdom of Our Forebears, Nature and Environment from a Filipino Perspective, asserts that the European and Western epistemologies were more rational and scientific, which denigrated and vilified the native ways of knowing the world as rudimentary, backward, and superstitious. Antonio Season concurs with the Filipino way of coming in contact with the world. The Spaniards did not find significant built structures for worship in the archipelago. The Filipino primal godhead Bathala and the host of Diwata did not require such human structures for their cult. The entire created world was their dwelling place. Nature itself was their temple. Season immersed himself in the experience of Quiapo, Black Nazarene, and understood that we cannot only speak of a Filipino worldview, it is more a world feel. The Filipino spirituality is infused with pagdama, raw, tactile, sensuous emotion. The immediate contact with the concrete representations of the divine is the way by which Filipino devotees feels God's grace. In his hermeneutics of serendipity, Season speaks of the conspiracy of grace in the encounter of the indigenous culture's creative genius and Iberian Christianity. Thus, in a creative dialectic, the Spanish Catholic culture and indigenous Filipino religious culture coexist, a religious double belonging. In the liminal interlude, the devotees claim Jesus as their own. The cross-bearing Nazarene is no longer the imported Spanish icon elevated on a marble altar in a state of inertia. It becomes the people's poong Jesus Itim na Nazareno, the enculturated savior figure who can be touched and be felt. Unquote. Immersing in the Passion, Marilo Ibata writes that it is the reading and the chanting of the Passion that Filipinos could connect the meanings of Christ's suffering with their own status as oppressed and colonial subjects, orienting themselves towards a new kind of collective soteriology premised on the rewards of martyric suffering in expressions of grief, tearful weeping, and wailing. Like the Black Nazarene, Passion is a visceral form of devotion. She, however, posed a critique of the ethnic-based characteristic of the Hudyo, which reeks of anti-Semitism against the spirit of Vatican II. Vivian S. M. Angeles also points out the lingering issues of discrimination and prejudice against Muslims due to the rise of Islamic fundamentalism and the military conflicts that continue to happen sporadically in southern Philippines. With the advent of religious pluralism, greater efforts should be done in promoting interreligious understanding. The same effort should be done in understanding the Philippine Independent Church, considered as an under-researched instance of Filipino Catholicism, as pointed out by Eleuterio Rebollido. Having emerged in the context of Philippine struggle for ecclesial and political independence, IFI is part of the religious history of the Philippines. Ferdinand Ano asks a provocative question in his article. Have we reached the point where we must uproot the cross and plant the podong of the Igorots instead? He criticized the Christianization's contribution to the marginalization of indigenous peoples, their spiritualities, and their ecocentric ways of living, and its contribution to the desecration and plunder of indigenous peoples' ancestral lands. On the contrary, Podong calls on people to be a community again and declares the land as holy, and thus to sacralize the earth, and calls for a jubilee for the earth that dwells within. As the article Pudong disrupts the colonization that accompanies Christianity, the article of Enriquez Velunta disrupts the hegemony of Western scholarship in biblical studies. Speaking of what he calls jeepney hermeneutics, he offers a reading of the scripture drawn from the resistance and liberation discourses from the Third World and Fourth World, or from the Global South. The last two articles by Cristina Liedo Gomez, Pinay Rise Up Bangon Na, and Jamina Hugo, Inang Diyos, Inang Bayan, the Virgin Mary and the Filipino identity, are narratives of resistance and empowerment against the intersecting oppressions in terms of race, sex, and gender, institutional, interpersonal, and internalized. Cristina asserts that Pinays internalize being white Europeans or Americans as superior and being Pinay as inferior, and their oppression is reinforced by a patriarchal and sexist church. She explores the turn to indigenous Babaylan as a form of feminist Pinay re-empowerment and a model for decolonizing, and suggests Jesus as the incarnation of God who's beyond gender and who came to uplift the poor and the marginalized as the model of feminist liberation and empowerment. Jamina explores the subversive, liberatory, and outright revolutionary potential of Marianism, as Mary, who is both a figure of both liberation and oppression, is upheld by Filipinos as a bastion of Filipino form of Catholicism. She proposes that Filipinos should explore more subversive Marian traditions in other countries in the light of a more hybrid and layered Marian Catholicism. I end as I began. To decolonize, to go against the helicopter Christianity, we have to deeply engage in the bullock cart Christianity, to be in contact with the ground, the soil of our Filipino Christianity, to be as totally immersed into the Filipino religion, culture, and the Filipino total way of life, covering a wide and expansive grounds. This book is a landmark book in Filipino theology. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Astorga. That is a very, 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 very generous assessment of our book. And I love the two images that you pose for us, the helicopter Christianity and the bullock cart Christianity, and the challenge to engage more with the bullock cart Christianity. So our final respondent for today, before we go into the Q&A, is Father Professor Eleazar Fernandez. He is Professor of Constructive Theology at United Theological Seminary of the Twin Cities. He's also current president of Union Theological Seminary in the Philippines. He is a well-known international name in the theological scene. Most of his recent works include Teaching in a World of Violent Extremism through Pickwick Publications, that was in 2021, Teaching for a Multi-Faith World, also through Pickwick in 2017, and Burning Center Porous Borders through Wittgenstock in 2011. And he's actually zooming in from somewhere in Asia at the moment because he's in the middle of lecturing somewhere. So thank you for joining us, Professor Fernandez.
Thank you. I'm now teaching for a semester at Yonsei University in South Korea. It's a privilege to be a part of this important event. Thank you for giving birth to this significant book. I say significant because the writers of this volume, through post-colonial optic, have challenged hegemonic narrative of Christianity's coming to the Philippines and the reception by Filipinos, and how it has traveled through Filipino diaspora, and have exposed the cunning and devious works of empire. Beyond challenging and exposing, I see inspiring and empowering creative articulations and reconstructions on how to decolonize or de-imperialize, which involves retrieval and rebaptism, and disentangle Christianity from various forms of hegemony. Moreover, the writers have shown examples on how to move forward in creating, constructing post-colonial, decolonial accounts of Christianity, such as the articulation of a future-oriented Marianism, the recontextualization of the Passion, the retrieval of Babaylanism as a form of Pinay empowerment, hermeneutics of serendipity, the retrieval of indigenous cosmologies and spiritualities for ecological healing, and more. All of us are born in the middle of a story we did not create or choose. History has bequeathed us Filipinos with a heritage, the Christian tradition. We did not ask for Christianity, but we have been gifted by our colonizers. This is part of our story. This is part of our history. We can wax in nostalgia of the Philippines before the coming of Christianity and the colonizers, but that is not of much help. The question now before us is, how shall we stand in relation to this living tradition? I say that we are to participate in the dynamic process of critical interpretation of this received tradition in the light of the realities and challenges of the present. Let's not confuse the two, Christianity and colonization. They are two different things, says Manila Auxiliary Bishop Roderick Pabilio. Nonetheless, while colonization and the Christian faith are distinct by textbook definition, their history in the Philippines and beyond is intertwined. If we love our faith and are grateful for being gifted with the Christian faith, we must expose this imbrication and interlocking connections. This is our way of liberating Christianity and even deeper of liberating Jesus from Christianity, which in some ways may have been alienated from the Jesus of Nazareth. Sharpening our post-colonial critique, I say that there is no pre-imperial, pre-colonial Christianity. There never was and never has been. It was gestated and nourished in the womb of empire. When it opened its young mouth, it spoke the many tongues of empire, even as Hellenism provided the theologos, to use the words of Catherine Keller. Scholars who are trying to reclaim the Bible, I underscore this, scholars who are trying to reclaim the Bible as resistance literature. We are so excited about that. For example, often forget that the biblical writings, even those that are critical of imperial powers, according to Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza, reinscribe the structures of domination against which they seek to argue. So it's not only about interpretation, it's the text itself and its production. Also, the production and dissemination of the Bible have led to Christian scriptural imperialism, making indigenous sacred text and wisdom subordinate, primitive, and perhaps demonic. This is a concern that may be pursued in the next projects. Given the challenge of the ubiquitous presence of colonial Christianity and our desire to move past imperial or colonial Christianity, I can understand the drive to excavate and emphasize nationalist impulses and trajectories of the Filipino people's struggles against colonial powers. And while these impulses need to be excavated and lifted because they provide resources and energies of anti-colonial narratives, we need to be alert of the dangers of nativistic, nationalistic streams, particularly their homogenizing tendencies, which silence critical voices. And you can see that happening in many authoritarian regimes, not only in the Philippines, but other parts of the world. Post-colonial optic, which is the lens employed by the writers of this volume, has helped us see the dangers of both colonialist and nativist narratives. Through post-colonial optic, which resist binarism and Orientalism. Careful with Orientalism in our attempt to go back to the past. Through post-colonial optic, which resist binarism and colonialism, our imagination has been open to see possibilities in which Filipinos responded to the presence of imperializing and colonializing Christianity. The encounter between imperial Christianity and the Filipino people and its rich traditions, as some have pointed out, was not really an encounter, as in encuentro, but encontronazo, clash, difference between encuentro and encontronazo. The clash, however, did not result in the total acceptance of everything foreign or in the abdication of everything indigenous. As pointed out in one essay in the volume, the Filipinos appropriated them in their own terms. Other writers agree. There is a consensus among scholars that what happened was not a one-way imposition, but a double process of conversion. The Filipinos were not passive receivers, but given their situation, were engaged in creative appropriation. Perhaps this is how we can speak of double truth, citing Bourdieu, or surplus of meaning, or another writer said, double-edged response, resilience, and incorruptibility to the overtures of Christianization. We can observe this critical and creative appropriation in many places around the world. Subaltern or subjugated communities have developed adaptive religiosities or spiritualities that nurture life and struggle for freedom under brutal situations. This critical and creative appropriation is happening not only with Filipinos in the geographic confines of the Philippines, but also among Filipino diasporas, as noted in some of the essays by our diaspora writers. We should not be surprised of this creative adaptation. Let's not forget, there never has been a pure, static Christianity. Christianity has always been adapting elements from its surrounding world. I think the view of enculturation as if it were an essential gospel is for me problematic. Okay. Christianity has always been adapting elements from its surrounding world. Any assertion of one original, pure, essential gospel, unspoiled gospel, only tells us that hegemonic power is at work trying to establish a regime of truth. What is crucial, I believe, is for us to sharpen our critical optics so we can identify hegemonic formation of power at various levels and forms in which Christianity has been imbricated in life-negating isms, including predatory capitalism and more, such as the crusading attitude that Christians have in relation to Muslims. The ghost of this colonial heritage continues to haunt Christian-Muslim relations to the present. Thanks for the only one essay that addressed this topic. The publication of this book is a significant contribution to our shared struggle, especially to decolonize Christianity. You have inspired, empowered, made us hopeful. To all who have made this significant project possible, I say congratulations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Fernandez. That was, again, a very generous response to our book. And I love that you pointed out that romanticization of pre-colonial Christianity or pre-colonial Philippines is not the way forward, but this grappling with this hybrid existence and what we've received and in response to what we're grappling with today. So we are now moving into our third and final section of the webinar. And this is where we answer any questions or comments that you have put in. And I note that there's quite a few already. And I'm also going to bring into this conversation my lovely co-editors, Professor Brazal and Professor Ibita. I'm just going to give a brief, I know you probably know them already, but I'm going to just give a brief bio on them anyway. So Professor Brazal is a full professor and holder of the Brother Adelino Manuel Professorial Chair for Religious Studies and Brother Flanan Paul FSC Professorial Chair for Rhetoric at the De La Salle University, Philippines. She is past president and founding member of the Dakoteo Catholic Theological Society of the Philippines and past coordinator of the Ecclesia of Women in Asia. She is the author of a number of books, some of which are A Theology of Southeast Asia, Liberation Post-Colonial Ethics in the Philippines, co-author of Intercultural Church, Bridge of Solidarity in the Migration Context, and I think that was with her husband, who's also a theologian, and she's the co-editor of 14 other anthologies, journal special issues in areas of post-colonial, migration, feminist, and cyber ethics theologies. And she just published Toward a Bi-Theology, Catholic Feminism in the Philippines, just last year. So she received her PhD from the Catholic University of Leuven. And the second the second person I wanted to bring in is my fellow co-editor, Ma Marilu Ibita. She's an associate professor at the Department of Theology and Religious Education at the De La Salle University in Manila, Philippines. She's also a visiting professor of contextual hermeneutical approaches to the Bible at the Faculty of Theology and Religious Studies at Catholic University Leuven in Belgium. Her primary research centers around biblical literature and Jewish-Christian dialogue. She is widely published, has co-edited a number of books. Some of her recent publications include The Johannine Peter's Trauma and Recovery, The Use of Luke in Fratelli Tutti, Filming Biblical Interpretations from the Ground, Anti-Empire Matthean Interpretations in Huwag Kang Papatay in 2017, and The Philippine Drug War Religions in 2024. So, might I begin with both of you, my fellow co-editors? Did you want to respond to anything or say something about what you think is the significance of this book for you, especially as you started to edit some of the articles? I might begin with Professor Brazal.
Thank you to Professor Astorga and Father Fernandez for the appreciation that you made of our anthology. For Professor Mendoza, I was really inspired by your sharing of your story of conversion to primal spirituality. I like the image in the title of your book, Back from the Crocodile Belly. So it's a way of reimaging the Babaylan coming out, no, from the mouth of the crocodiles, to which the missionaries, threw them, no, to be devored. I also liked Professor Parkinson's creative rereading of scripture to suggest rebaptism into a Christian spirituality rooted in the land and indigenous ancestry. Lastly, I also found very insightful Dr. Jamina's talk about the Virgin and Filipino identity, particularly your rereading of the Virgin of Balintawak. I have two questions for you. So first, what do you think of those theologians who would, of their thinking that the devotion to Mary in the Philippines is rooted in the indigenous belief in God the Mother? And we know that this we can still see, no, in the different sects in Mount Banahaw, no, where they have integrated Mother God in the Trinity. No? Then I have a second question. Well, it's about the Mary's encounter with Jesus. No, somebody mentioned about the spiritual exercises, citing that. No, but in the Philippines we have the salubong. No, I don't know if you are familiar with that, no? Where Mary and Jesus meet, and that's very popular. And in fact, the feminist critique of that is, where is Mary Magdalene? So again, we are glorifying the mother. No, it's all right for the mother to be there, but Mary Magdalene also, who is not a mother but a disciple, an apostle, should also be there. No? Because in the Gospels we see Jesus having his first appearance to Mary Magdalene. So those 2 points.
So I answer now, or are we waiting for
Go for it, please.
Okay.
Yes, this
Well,
discussion.
actually, like both of those were in the chapter.
Yeah. Okay.
As I wrote it. So I didn't have, I was very like, I was trying to keep it down to the time limit, so I wasn't able to cram in everything that I had in the chapter. But there's definitely a section in there about, I guess, like these traces or reworkings of like a pre-colonial mother goddesses. So I wasn't mentioning just Banahaw, but
Okay.
also like Maria
Mhm.
Makiling. It's somehow like she's Maria Makiling. I thought that was always interesting. Like somehow these Diwatas turn into some kind of Maria. I thought that was very significant somehow.
Yes, now I remember that. Yeah.
But at the same time, these can still be like very marginal. And I think someone, like I got a Q&A comment from somebody that called homegrown Christianity, like versions of Christianity, like the Aglipayan Church sects. And I thought that this terminology was very interesting because at least like in German term, I guess like social sciences or even in popular language, like sect is inseparable from cult. So it's even when we try to bring up these pre-colonial traditions, there's this automatic tendency a lot of the time to think of it as something like it's there, but it's underground, but it's marginal, but it's a sect, it's a cult. So it's not just that we remember them, but also how we remember them. So there's still like this kind of like filtration through this idea that there's a real Christianity and then there's this other underground thing that's a bit like, As for like Salubong, that's also in the chapter. I kind of cheated a
Okay.
little bit in the presentation. I hope you'll forgive me. In a previous draft of the chapter, I had the Italian example first, and then I switched it out for the Salubong one. It's actually kind of one of the overarching arguments in a lot of like research and discussions that I do, that there should be more mutual exchange between Philippine like humanities and social sciences and like the international field, whether we're talking about Europe or Latin America, where we share this Catholic tradition. There's also a bit in there about maybe us having more exchange with Latin American studies and their Marianismo machismo thing. There could be a lot of fruitfulness there. So I thought, okay, I already had the Aglipayan example. Please let me have the Italian one. so that I can have one example that's very much about, Filipino traditions and celebrations, and then something that's about a kind of Marianism that we can see, but it's explicitly a European one, because at the same time, we're not completely separate we're not separate from that, and we shouldn't be. But thanks for giving me a chance to also talk about like the other things that I couldn't find space for. Very grateful.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Now for maybe just something about the significance of the book. So I think it can give us models of doing post-colonial theology. And yesterday I was in this conference about key controversial issues on the synod or in the synod. So this include women deacons, LGBTQ, complicated marital situations. So I think we can draw a lot, no, from this book and our pre-colonial traditions in rethinking, no, how the church should, in a way, respond, no, to these issues. We actually did a nationwide survey about people's perspectives on women in the diacony. And surprisingly, 80% are in favor. No, normally if you talk to priests, they would say, "Oh no, the people are not ready." But the survey says otherwise. Maybe in the past they don't talk about it because they don't have the language to talk about it. No, but there you see, no. Well, the spirit of the babaylan, no? It is there, and they see female leadership operating, and so the need to just recognize this formally within the church. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Professor Brazal. Professor Abida, did you want to say something?
Yeah, good morning, everybody. Good afternoon to those who are in Sydney, and good evening to those who are in Washington, D.C. and the rest of the U.S. or whichever time zone, and early morning for Jamina since she is in Aachen. Thank you for staying so late or so early. Thank you so much. I'm just very glad and very thankful to be with every one of you, with the co-authors, as well as with our two very generous reviewers, Professor Astorga and Professor Fernandez. I also would like, before I forget, I also would like to acknowledge our early reviewers before the publication of the book who wrote our blurbs. I'd like to thank Professor Kwok Quilan, also Sister Mary Jan Mananzan, and also Professor and Brother Carl Gaspar. You would find those early reviews, very small reviews, in our book itself. I find that this book not only helped us remember that the contributors are indeed theologians. Thank you for saying that, Professor Astorga, that Filipino feminist theologizing has arrived, but also to know that many are practitioners and very much immersed in the ongoing discussion. If we can speak about it as part of the synodal process, even before we have that term, synodal process, I can see that there's a lot of avenues in which we can continue the dialogue after the 500 years. What awaits us in the next 500 years, if we may say that. The first one is from the perspective of the critical impact of the Spanish colonial Christianity in relation to the indigenous peoples, because we do know that the indigenous peoples in the Philippines have been marginalized in our contemporary setting. But also I was very, very happy because the aspect of ecology has been brought up. We have the contributions of Professor Perkinson. We have the contributions of Lorena, all talking about this aspect, as well as the perspective of the indigenous peoples from the work of Bishop Ambo and Incel. And then I also see very important aspect on the political engagement of Catholic Christianity, particularly in the Philippines, which is very, very important. And that's why I really like the way the martial law perspective and the continuing struggle, including the most recent election in which the Catholic Church has been very clear on the values that we do need to see from the perspective of Christianity and its upholding of human dignity, which is a very big question, at least for me, when we celebrated 2021, 500 years of Christianity, yay to social justice, human dignity, and so on. And yet, come 2022, such a terrible disappointment with the election of the son of the dictator. So that's, I think, an aspect that we can continue in the horizons of what's next in the Catholic Christianity. Another aspect that I see is very much part of the discussion in the whole book and the overlapping articles would be living as a Filipino Christian in the Philippines, but also in the diaspora. That's very clear. I did not only talk about that from the perspective of the Passion being online now, because it cannot be done in Middle Eastern countries, or they cannot attend that when they are there as seafarers and so on and so forth. But also in dialogue with other churches. I think we should call them churches, especially for instance with the IFI and the link to the IFI, which Peter Ben mentioned with the Old Catholics. So there's a lot of discussion. I have just recently facilitated the virtual meeting of Bishop David and Peter Ben from the perspective of Old Catholics, who are also coming here in the Philippines and engaging in dialogue and also in groundwork. So that's another aspect. And then we have this perspective of the interreligious dialogue. And I like that that was underscored, even if we only have one presentation, which was part of the original discussion, actually. I am glad that Vivian could help us with that. Basically because we have Muslims here in the Philippines, but also because for global Filipinos, the Muslim countries is one of the destination areas for overseas Filipino workers. But not only that, also in Western countries where we have a lot of Muslims, as well as in terms of interreligious dialogue with the Jewish communities. There are so many Filipino people who are in Israel. And for me, the idea of the ethnic issue of putting the Jews in a negative light in the Passion, I think it really calls for a rethinking, and or maybe we need to have a new edition of that, because in Lenten season, when we have like this year, the short version of the Markan Gospel is read, the Johannine Gospel is always inserted as part of the reading, and we have a lot of that, the denigrating views of the Jews, and which is one of the, at least from the biblical aspect, one of the important issues that we need to battle with from the perspective of anti-Semitism. And yet, because of what is going on right now in Palestine and in Israel, that is a very, very hot topic that we do need to engage in terms of the how do we look at the biblical text in terms of colonization? There's a lot of colonization there, but also the perspective of triumph. Sometimes it's very difficult to read that how the issue of war, how issues of how rape, they are all entangled in the biblical text, and that's something that we can see in all the wars that's going on, especially in what's happening in the Holy Land. Another aspect that I see as a frontier in our common work, which is also part and parcel of the immersion and not just the helicopter Christianity that Professor Astorga mentioned, is that of the double sidedness that Father Danny was talking about. because all of these aspects that we have in terms of the OFWs as the new missionaries or the new heroes, or also the aspect of ecology. We do know that one of the move of the CBCP right now is to divest itself of investments that are related to mining and so on and so forth. So what Professor Fernandez brought up in terms of biblical interpretation, which is my academic realm of working, is in the biblical interpretation of texts that are used not only in terms of social justice or a faith that does justice, but also from the perspective of how these biblical texts are used to colonize and not to decolonize. So I think that there's a lot of work to be done in the next 500 years, and I'm very grateful for everyone's contribution.
That's right.
Thank you so much, Professor Evita. Yeah, it was such a pleasure to work with you and Professor Brazal on this book. There's a lot of comments, and I can see that they're also being answered. And I wish I could address all of them, but first of all, I want to acknowledge, I think Mark Miller had mentioned something about one of the pieties of the Marian pieties is a practice of lex orandi, lex credendi, and I think that was more of a comment, and I think that was a really good point to make. But I don't think it's there anymore. And then there's a question here, which is an interesting one, by Emmanuel Soga, who says he's done a 5-year research in the Philippines precisely on the topic we're looking at. Now, going forward, how does the book address, or rather harness, the religious passion of Pinoy Christian theologians in addressing the issue of colonial ecclesiology that has become so anchored in the generational heritage of Pinoy Christians? I think that's the whole point of the book. So I think you might have to just read the book and then grapple with that answer. There's so much to say in that. And there is a particular question, and I think we only have room for one to address one question, and that is, oh God, what's happened? Oh, yeah. And it was an interesting one where it was talking about, oh yes, by Tyrone Gutera. He said, I remember my previous congregation, which was Ang Dating Daan, and they think women are not qualified for church leadership. And it's true. It's still today, we have that in practice, especially in Filipino congregations, but just everywhere as well. So his question is, how can, yeah, he has this assumption that other Christian congregations use these verses too to suppress female leadership. The Corinthians, the Corinthians line, you know, women submit to wives submit to your husbands, what we call the household codes. So then how can this be reconciled in the backdrop of women empowerment in church leadership? Again, this is something that's such a loaded question, but maybe I'll give a chance for one of our panelists to say something to this. You know, we have this ideal, but then we have this a heritage from our Filipino past. Like, how do we reconcile with this wanting to empower women, but then we have this current structure?
Yeah, can I take that up? Since I work on the Pauline text and on 1 Corinthians, I think the first thing to note is that there are many different interpretations of this text. Okay, so in addition to the extra canonical, which has different ways of presenting women in their text, both in positive and also in a way that they are subdued, it is very important to note that even within Roman Catholic Christianity and in the academic biblical interpretation, which is an ecumenical and interreligious enterprise, academic biblical perspective on this text is always very wary and already very much aware that we do need to also sift through the perspective of the liberating aspect of what Paul was saying, but at the same time to see how they are also within their own context. And so the Roman patriarchal culture is very much woven into the different aspects of the biblical narrative. So doing a post-colonial, the colonial reading, feminist perspective of the biblical text, any biblical text, is something that has to continue to be done, not only from the level of academics, but also in terms of working with women who are prevented from flourishing because of people who are using these kinds of texts to suppress women, to silence women, and so on and so forth. So there is a lot of possibilities right now to question this one kind of interpretation and to see this from a larger perspective of those who are doing contextual theologizing. Maybe Professor Fernandez can also say something about that, because we are both in the biblical academy. Professor Fernandez, Father. You are muted po. Would you like to say something? You're muted po. Kindly unmute.
I'm not really in the biblical field, but of course I was also trained there. That was my minor. And as I said earlier, we can try as much as we can in relation to interpreting text, but I think we also need to push the envelope outside of the text. And I think interpreting text of liberations are also, as we have learned in post-colonial criticism, texts of liberations are also texts of terror and narratives of terror. And so we have to really engage in multiple readings. What I really like with this book, and I must say, is that different from when you only use the method of structural materialism, you can expect the outcome. It's much easier to read. But with post-colonial optic, I can see the fluidity and many and multiple interpretations that make it sound so exciting. So for me, when I use structural materialism, it's easy to predict the conclusion. But this one is, I enjoy the playfulness, the creativity of the writers, because there are multiple meanings and I cannot easily predict where you are heading in terms of your interpretation of Mary and so forth and others. So I think this work is exciting, and I would say I'm going to use this book for Filipino theology that I teach and also for Asian theology. And I have found one book. I don't have to buy many books, but one collection of books, and this is very helpful.
That's right.
Thank you so much. I think Professor Brazal has something to say.
I think that text in Corinthians, well, according to Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza, is a later addition in order to align it with 1 Timothy, which is, of course, written towards the end of the 1st century. The text that says, wives, well, what is that? Women should be silent in the church. So that was written later by a disciple of Paul. So this text in Corinthians was added so that it would be aligned with 1 Timothy. But I'm not a scripture scholar, but I read it.
Christina,
Yes,
Jim
yes.
may want to say something because
Oh, yes, he's a biblical scholar. Go ahead.
he will
Jim.
always say, "How do you read?" Right?
Go for it, Jim.
Unmute yourself. Unmute yourself.
Jim,
You're still
unmute yourself.
muted.
There we go.
There.
Yeah, I mean, I already said it. I could go on and on, but yeah, for me, it's a matter of it's not a matter of trying to get it right. as if the Bible is an infallible product and we just have to understand what the author was saying and what the audience was receiving, but rather it's interpretation out of our own political situation always, as far as I'm concerned.
Mhm.
And so for me, I sometimes talk about the Bible as my saxophone. The question is, can I play it with pizzazz, with improvisation in response to the kinds of vibes around me and the politics and the trauma and the pain and the grief, and constantly be making it have an effect that pushes towards liberation or pushes towards
Right.
greater return to what we've lost, which is relationship with the more than human world. That if we continue to insist we are the number one species and everything else is at our beck and call to do with what we want, I think we don't have a future on the planet in the very near term.
That's true.
I think that's a great comment to end with on this wonderful a webinar that we've just experienced. I'm going to end here because I want to end on the 2-hour dot. So thank you so much for everyone who's attended, to everyone who's contributed here and giving your insights into your chapters, Dr. Jugo, Dr. Perkinson, Dr. Mendoza, and to your wonderful responses, Dr. Astorga and Dr. Fernandez. And I want to just quickly thank certain people, Pan Macmillan for publishing our book, for Mark Chapman for accepting this book into the series, Pathways for Ecumenical and Interreligious Dialogue, for Vladimir Latinovic, who encouraged us to put it forward with that series, for Peter Fan, who wrote the foreword for this book, and as Marilu Ibita has already pointed out, the Sister Mary John, Brother Carl Gaspar, and Professor Puilan for the wonderful blurbs they wrote for us, to the Berkeley Center for hosting us again. Thank you so much for doing this and allowing us to reach out to the whole world. And this video will be on their site forever, so you can rewatch this again if you missed out on something. To our institutions, BPI, De La Salle University, Leuven University, Charles Sturt, and finally to you who've attended and engaged with this material. We look forward to continually engaging with you with this material, and we hope that this might inspire you to theologize yourself and engage with the issues that are brought up in this book. So thank you very much. I don't know if I've missed out on anybody. Have I hopefully thanked everyone that I need to?
Well,
but now,
Christina, we do need to thank the colleagues who are in Springer in helping give birth to this book. So thank you to everyone in Springer.
Thank you, Springer, Pan Macmillan, Vinod, and Manesh, and
Sujata.
Yes, and Sujata. Yeah, that's it, Sujata. Thank you so much to them for the going back and forth, the editing. So before we finish up, Professor Leo Lefebvre will say some few words, final words, and then we will end with a beautiful prayer that is said in various languages in the Philippines. So thank you again for joining us. Professor Lefebvre.
So as our time for discussion comes to an end, on behalf of Georgetown University and the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, I'd like to thank our moderator, Cristina Yedo Gomez, and all our contributors for sharing these very creative insights and stimulating observations. Obviously, much more could be said, and so to learn more, I'd like to encourage all our viewers to acquire a copy of this outstanding book, and I thank all of you for joining our conversation.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah, that's the code to get the 20% off discount. I know it's a bit pricey, so try and get your library to buy a copy. Please go ahead, Imogen, for and play the prayer.
Pangalan ng kaloobang walang kasing ganda at ng mukhang lubos na kaaya-aya at ng paramdam na tunay na nakagigimhawa. Ginoo nga magbubuhat, Ginoo sa among mga katigulangan, among nasinati ang imong mahigugmaong kaayo diha sa hulagway ni Jesus imong anak, kansang sugilano nagdasig kanamo sa among timuha sa maangayon nga katilingban, diin ang tanan mahilakip.
Kami ay natitipon na ang aming mga puso ay tigip sa pasasalamat sa pagdiriwang namin ng 500 taon ng Kristyanismo. Kami ay nagdiriwang sa walang hanggang kaloob na pananampalataya na nagpapanatili sa amin sa masaganang pag-ibig at biyayang ibinahagi mo sa amin at sa pagkakaisa na aming tinatamasa bilang magkakapatid kay Kristo.
Kapamilataning kasalpantayanan abigalumong kay kami, sa upan mo kaming magsikap baning yato maginyang kalupaning kay kang kayarian. Sa diin may pagpaambitanay sa mga bahandi sang kalibutan, kag wala na sang may ginagutom, sa diin may pagtahod sa mga magkalain-lain nga mga tribo kag kultura, kag ang paghidait nga napasad sa hustisya ang labaw nga manggagahom sa tanan. Dawaten mi daytoy babaen tinaga ni Jesus nga nasantuan nga Apo tayo ken ti panangibabaet ni Santa Maria nga ina tayo. Amen.